I want you to stay with me on this one, because it starts the way a lot of bad weeks start, with something small that doesn't feel like anything yet. A woman walked onto my lot on a Tuesday afternoon, bought a car with cash, asked me not to log the sale right away, and 2 days later she was dead. Somehow I was left holding the only thing that could explain why it happened and who was behind it. I've been selling cars for going on 9 years, and I know what it looks like when someone is running from something. I thought I knew exactly what I was seeing when she walked through that door, and I was wrong about almost all of it. Here's what I keep asking myself, even now. How many times do you look away from something before looking away becomes the whole story of who you are? My name is Terrence, I'm 34 years old, and I sell used cars at a small independent lot called Calhoun Motor Group, which is a fancy name for 12 rows of vehicles on a gravel patch off Route 19 outside of Macon, Georgia. I was at my desk eating a sandwich on a Tuesday in late October when she came through the door, maybe 40 years old, dark coat, hair pulled back tight, and she walked like someone who already knew where she was going and didn't have time to waste getting there. She didn't browse the lot or kick any tires or do any of the things people do when they're pretending to be casual about a decision they've already made. She looked at the inventory board on the wall, pointed at the second listing from the top and said, "Is that Civic still available?" I told her it was, grabbed the keys, and walked her out through the first row. On the way, she slowed down. Just for a second, barely noticeable, beside an older gray Civic parked at the end of the row, and she glanced at the door panel with a look that I filed away without quite understanding why. Then she kept walking like she hadn't stopped at all. At the newer Civic, she sat in the driver's seat for maybe 30 seconds, ran her hand across the steering wheel, then opened the glove box and did something I'd never seen a customer do in 9 years. She felt along the inside edges with her fingers, working through the corners methodically, like she was checking for something specific rather than looking at the car. When she got out, she said simply, "I'll take it." "You don't want to know the mileage?" I asked. "I saw it on the board. You don't want to drive it first?" She looked at me then, really looked at me, the kind of look that's measuring something it doesn't say out loud. "I don't have time for a test drive. Can we do this inside?" At my desk, she put a bank envelope on the table and slid it toward me, and when I opened it, I found the full asking price in cash, counted out exactly, like she'd done it beforehand, and knew precisely what she was walking in with. "I'll need your ID and we'll get the paperwork started," I said. She nudged the envelope a little closer. "Is there any way you could wait a few days before you log the sale?" I set my pen down and looked at her. "What do you mean, wait?" "I mean exactly that. Fill out the paperwork today. Hold it for maybe a week before you file it anywhere." "That's not really something I'm not asking you to do anything illegal." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something she was working carefully to keep out of her face. "I'm just asking you to wait a few days before anything is on paper. That's all I'm asking." I looked at her for a moment, and that was when I noticed the bruise on her left wrist, dark, maybe 4 or 5 days old, sitting just below the cuff of her coat. She saw me looking at it and didn't move her arm. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I'm fine, because if someone is..." I said I'm fine. Not sharp, just final, the way someone speaks when they've already had this conversation too many times with too many people, and they've run out of energy to explain themselves all over again. "I just need a few days before anything is on paper. Can you do that or not?" That was the moment, and I knew it even then. The right thing was sitting right in front of me, and I could see it clearly. And then my phone buzzed on the desk with my daughter Maya's name on the screen, and I looked at Claudette, and I looked at the phone, and I hit the side button and sent Maya to voicemail. "I can hold it a few days," I told her. She nodded without smiling. No thank you, no warmth, just the acknowledgement of someone who had already moved on to the next problem. I handed her the keys, and she walked out to the Civic and drove off the lot. And I didn't know it then, but that was the last time I would see Claudette Reeves alive. Detective Olsen came to the lot Thursday morning just after 9. A tall man in his 50s with a slow, deliberate way of moving that wasn't casualness at all, but a practiced kind of patience, the kind you develop when you've learned that silence makes people fill the space in ways they didn't intend. He told me Claudette had been found Wednesday night on a fire road off County Line, still in the Civic I'd sold her, and that while the preliminary read was a single vehicle accident, there were details that didn't line up, and he was talking to people who'd had recent contact with her. I told him everything. The cash, the request to hold the paperwork, the bruise on her wrist, and he wrote it all down without reacting to any of it. Anything else unusual while she was here? He asked. There was a truck, I said, dark-colored, black or maybe dark green, that circled the block twice while she was inside. It slowed down at the entrance both times, like the driver was looking for something specific, and there was no visible front plate. Olsen looked up from his notepad. How long between when she left and when you noticed the truck was gone? 5 minutes, maybe less. He studied me for a moment. You think about asking her more about that bruise? The question landed flat and uncomfortable in the space between us. I thought about it, I said. But you didn't. She told me she was fine. People say that, he said, and he closed his notepad and left without elaborating. After he was gone, I stood in the lot for a while, telling myself it was probably a husband or a boyfriend. The bruise, the cash, the careful fear she'd been wearing like a second coat, because that version of events fit together in a way that felt true, and I held on to it because the alternative, the idea that something worse was happening and I'd helped it along by looking the other way, was not something I was ready to examine yet. I tried calling Maya that afternoon, and it went to voicemail, and I didn't leave a message. Friday morning, a man I'd never seen before walked onto the lot at 8:45, just as I was unlocking the office, and something about the way he moved made me watch him through the window for a full minute before I went outside. He was solid rather than tall, built like someone who'd worked physical jobs his whole life, wearing a jacket that was too light for October, and he walked the rows slowly with his hands in his pockets, in a way that had nothing to do with looking at cars. "Help you find something?" I said. He turned and looked at me with wide, plain features and the kind of eyes that don't give you anything to read. "Just looking," he said. "Anything specific I can help with? You sell a Civic earlier this week? Tuesday, maybe?" Something moved through my chest and I kept my face easy. "We move a few cars a week. You looking for a Civic?" "I'm looking for one that came off this lot on Tuesday." He was watching me the way you watch a car dealer, not hostile, just very carefully, tracking every small thing. "I'd have to check the records," I said. "You in the market for something or—" "The woman who bought it," he said, cutting past everything else. "Did she leave anything behind? In the office, on the lot, anywhere at all?" I looked at him steadily. "We clean the cars before they go out. Nothing gets left behind." He held my eyes for a moment, then smiled in the way people smile when they want you to think they believe you, but they're not making any promises. "Appreciate it," he said, and he handed me a card with a first name, Bobby, and a phone number. Nothing else. If anything does turn up, I'd love a call before anything else happens with it. He walked off the lot without looking at another car, and I stood there with the card in my hand and the cold weight of that phrase settling into my stomach. Before anything else happens with it. Because that's not something you say when you think someone left their sunglasses in a cup holder. I called Olsen right away, and when I couldn't reach him, I left a message and went back inside and sat at my desk and thought about Claudette slowing beside that gray Civic on her way through the first row, and the way she'd felt along the door panel of the car she bought, working her fingers into the corners, and what exactly she might have been thinking when she did it. Olsen called me back 2 hours later and I told him about Bobby, the description, the card, the phrase he'd used on his way out. "Don't call that number," Olsen said, "and don't discuss any of this with anyone at the lot." I asked him straight out if Claudette's death was an accident or not, and after a pause he said they were treating it as a homicide, and then he told me what he'd found out. She'd been divorced for 6 years, no current partner, no domestic incident history anywhere in her record, and the ex-husband had been in Atlanta all week with confirmed alibis. The husband theory was gone, and everything I'd been holding on to went with it. I told him about the gray Civic, about how Claudette had slowed beside it on the way through the lot, the way she'd looked at the door rather than the body of the car, and he went quiet in a way that felt like thinking rather than nothing. "Don't touch that car," he said. "I'm coming down." He arrived in 20 minutes and walked the lot with me, and when I showed him where she'd slowed, he put on a glove and opened the driver's door of the gray Civic himself, running his hand along the inside of the panel, then moving to the rear passenger door. He stopped and looked at me over the roof of the car without saying anything, but something had shifted in his face. He told me to go back inside the office, and I asked him what was there, and he said, "Inside, now," in a voice that wasn't asking, so I went. He came in 20 minutes later with an evidence bag containing a USB drive, small, clear-taped flat against the doorframe. The kind of thing you'd walk past 100 times without ever noticing it was there. "She put that there," I said, while I was pulling her paperwork. "That's what it looks like," he said. "What's on it?" "That's what we're going to find out," he said, and he left, and I sat in my office and thought about Claudette walking past that gray Civic and making a decision in 3 seconds that nobody witnessed. Calm in the way someone is calm when they've already accepted what they're walking into, and they're only trying to make sure the work survives them. Saturday morning, Bobby came back, and this time he came in through the side entrance and walked straight to the office door without looking at a single car on the lot. He knocked twice and opened the door before I could respond, and he stood in the frame for a moment before coming in. "You find anything?" he said. "I told you, we cleaned the cars." He stepped inside and sat down in the customer chair across from my desk like he'd been there before and planned to stay a while. "Here's the thing," he said, with the relaxed tone of someone laying out a reasonable position in a disagreement between friends. "I think you might have found something, and I think you're sitting here deciding what to do with it, and I just want to help you make that decision correctly." "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." He leaned back slightly, unhurried. "The woman who bought that car, she was involved with some people she shouldn't have been, and she was carrying something that doesn't belong to her anymore. Whatever she might have left behind, it doesn't do anyone any good now, and the people it belonged to just want it back quietly. You follow me?" I looked at him sitting in the same chair where Claudette had sat 3 days ago, sliding her cash envelope across my desk with a bruise on her wrist, and 8 months of documented evidence in a bank envelope, and, apparently, a plan already forming for where to hide the backup, and something in me stopped being careful. "Who do you work for?" I said. Something shifted in his face, just slightly, just for a moment. "I'm just trying to help a situation stay simple." "Ray Denton," I said. The name landed, and his expression went absolutely still, and for 2 full seconds he didn't move or speak. Then he leaned forward and the friendly disagreement register was completely gone. "That's a name you should be very careful with," he said quietly, and his voice had dropped to something that wasn't quite a threat, but was standing right next to one. "Claudette Reeves spent 8 months building a case," I said, "and you ran her off a fire road." I hadn't planned to say it. I hadn't planned any of this, but I'd been sitting with the word homicide since Olsen said it on Thursday, and Bobby in my customer chair talking about helping me make decisions correctly was more than I could hold quietly. He stood up slowly, and the calm of it was worse than anger would have been. "I'd think very carefully," he said, "about what you know, what you don't know, and what the difference between those 2 things is worth to you." He picked up a pen from my desk, held it for a moment without any particular expression, then set it back down and walked out. I had my phone in my hand before he cleared the door, and Olsen picked up on the first ring. "He just left my office," I said. "I know," Olsen said. "We've been on him since this morning. Stay inside the office and don't leave the lot." Through the window I watched Bobby walking toward the lot entrance with his hands in his pockets, and then I noticed the silver sedan parked at the far end of the street that I hadn't paid attention to before, and 2 men were getting out of it as Bobby reached the sidewalk, plainclothes, but the way they moved made it completely clear who they were. Bobby stopped and looked at them, then looked back at my office window, and one of the men said something I couldn't hear through the glass. Bobby looked at the ground and put his hands up slowly, and I sat there and watched through the window as they walked him to the sedan, and I didn't move until Olsen pulled into the lot 4 minutes later. He sat down in the same chair Bobby had just been in and told me that Ray Denton had been taken into custody an hour ago at his property outside the city, that 2 associates had been picked up in Bibb County the night before, including the man who'd been following Claudette, and that what was on the drive she'd left in the door panel matched evidence recovered from a storage unit connected to Denton's operation. "She built a thorough case," Olsen said. 8 months of inspections, payments, names. It's thorough work. I asked him about the daughter. I'd heard it mentioned in passing at the station, and he confirmed that Claudette had sent her 9-year-old to stay with a sister in Augusta 2 weeks before she came to my lot, because she knew things were getting dangerous, and that the sister had filed for emergency custody that morning. I sat with that for a while, thinking about a woman who had run the numbers on what she was walking into, put her daughter in a car and driven her to safety, and then come back alone to finish what she'd started, who had walked into my lot and bought a car and hidden a backup drive in a door panel of a car that wasn't even hers, trusting that it would sit there untouched long enough for someone to find it. She didn't trust a person with it, I said. She trusted the fact that nobody was going to move that car for a month. She trusted the situation. Olsen said. You just happened to be part of it. I looked at him. Is that supposed to make me feel better? He almost smiled and told me he needed me at the station that afternoon for a follow-up interview. At the door, he stopped and turned back. For what it's worth, he said, you called it in, you noticed the car, and you didn't take Bobby's offer. Claudette did the heavy lifting, but you didn't get in the way of it. That's something. It was late Sunday when Olsen finally let me go from the station, and I sat in my car in the parking lot with nowhere in particular to be. 15-minute drive to an empty apartment, a refrigerator with not much in it, and a week ahead that would involve lawyers and statements and conversations I wasn't looking forward to. I need you to understand something before I tell you what I did next, because I don't say this as a lesson, and I'm not saying it to make myself sound better than I was. I say it because it's true, and I've spent too long keeping it at a distance. I hadn't gone to my daughter's recital 3 months ago. I told Maya I had a customer, and that was a lie. What actually happened was that I pulled off Route 75 into a gas station parking lot about 20 minutes outside of Valdosta and sat there for half an hour and then turned around and drove home. Not because I didn't want to be there, because I wanted it so much that I was afraid of what her face would do to me when I walked in. That half second of surprise before the smile, the look that would tell me she hadn't been sure I was really coming. I was afraid of being seen that clearly by a 10-year-old who loved me without any conditions I'd done anything to earn, and so I turned the car around and called her from that gas station parking lot and told her I had a customer. That was the thing I'd been living around for 3 years. Not the distance, not the schedule, not the 2 hours of highway between Macon and Valdosta. Just that one decision I kept making over and over, wearing different clothes each time. I thought about Claudette pulling onto a fire road with people behind her who wanted what she was carrying, and the 8 months before that, the photographs, the spreadsheets, the long patient work of proving something true, and I thought about her putting her daughter in a car and driving her to Augusta and then turning around and going back because she decided the work mattered enough to pay whatever it cost. I called Maya. Her mother answered, cautious. I don't call on Sundays and it was getting late. I asked if I could talk to Maya, and there was a pause before she called her name down the hall, and then I heard Maya come on with that dad. She always uses question mark and no question mark at the same time because she's never quite certain which version of me is going to be on the other end of the line. Hey, Bug, I said. I'm sorry I missed your call Tuesday. It's okay, she said. It's not, actually. I looked out the windshield at the parking lot. I want to come down next weekend, if that works. She was quiet for a moment. Mom would have to say yes. I know. I'll ask her. I just wanted to tell you first. Another silence, and I could hear her breathing and thinking it over. And then she said, I saved you the program from the recital. And I had to look away from the phone for a second before I could answer her. I really want to see it, I said. I really, really do. Monday morning I came in early to clean the cars in the first row before the lot opened. And when I got to the gray Civic, I vacuumed the floors and wiped down the dash and then reached under the driver's seat, and my hand touched paper. It was a crayon drawing on a half sheet of printer paper, a woman and a child holding hands, the child drawn slightly taller than the woman the way kids always do it, putting themselves at the center of the world's scale, standing in front of a house with a yellow door with just the two of them in the picture and no one else. I sat on the running board of the car and held it for a long time, thinking about how it might have gotten there. Whether Claudette's daughter had been in that car before her mother drove it to Macon, or whether Claudette had been carrying it in her coat pocket and it had fallen out when she crouched down beside the door panel of the gray Civic. And I thought about how it had been under that seat through all of it, through Bobby's visit and Olsen's sweep and everything, and here it was in my hands on a Monday morning in October. I don't know whether Claudette's daughter will be okay, or whether understanding that her mother fought that hard will help her, or just make the absence sharper, or what it costs a child to grow up knowing the person who loved her most made the choice to go back. But I know that Claudette looked at the full cost of what she was doing and paid it without flinching, that she didn't have certainty the evidence would matter, or that anyone would find what she left behind, and that she trusted it anyway, trusted the work, trusted that what was true deserved to survive her, trusted a used car lot in Macon that she'd never been to before to hold something safe. I'm still sitting with what she trusted me with, and I'm not sure I've earned it yet, but I'm trying to be someone who might. There's a difference between being absent and being gone, And I think you probably know what I mean by that, even if your story looks nothing like mine. You can be answering the calls and showing up on the right days and saying mostly the right things, and still be keeping yourself at a distance that nobody can measure because you've never named it out loud. And I did that for 3 years and told myself it was complicated when the truth was that I was just making a choice, the same choice every single day. If there's someone who's been leaving you messages you haven't returned, not because you don't love them, but because love means they can see you clearly and you're not ready for that, then I don't know what to tell you except that Claudette Reeves didn't get a Tuesday back, and none of us do. Thanks for listening. If you want more stories like this, please like and subscribe.